Jeff Tarrant, and I'm a psychologist based in Eugene, Oregon. And most of the work that I do is in the field of neuroscience. So looking at EEG data, specifically quantitative EEG, and see how do things change, what's different in different states of consciousness. So most of my work is involved using that technology from a research perspective to look at different abilities that people claim to have, whether it's, something more mundane like meditation or something more extraordinary like mediumship or psychic abilities or telepathy. The Telepathy Tapes project is really investigating and exploring the stories and the lives of a wide number of non-speaking autistic individuals that their parents claim have these really extremely accurate telepathic abilities. My involvement, I was invited to participate to do the brain imaging, to do the quantitative EEG assessments for some of these individuals as part of the documentary. And honestly, I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. At that point, I knew very little about this population and about their abilities. So I really kind of went in fairly blind to what all was going to be happening. Honestly, what I saw just from the beginning was sort of jaw-dropping. All of these individuals, because they're non-speakers, they communicate by pointing to letters and numbers on a letterboard. So they can spell, and so they are able to share what's going on through that process, which otherwise, and that's actually an interesting part of the story, is that so many of these families, they didn't know if there was somebody in there. One of the topics that comes up a lot is this idea of presuming competence. That, we've assumed that because they don't have good control over their bodies and because they're not able to verbally communicate, that they're not competent. And so in school, they would be taught their numbers and colors into high school, just over and over and over and over again. And then it turns out once they're able to communicate through spelling, turns out they've got a vast amount of knowledge that nobody had any idea. They're very intelligent. They're very articulate if they can just get it out. There's kind of two different ways to talk about the research that I was involved in, because even though my job wasn't primarily to run the telepathy tests, I was involved in some of that. I had actually worked with a colleague of mine to create a computer-based system for testing telepathy, so that there were two computers, and one of them would present a random word or a random number to the sender. And this is the person who is looking at the information and then trying to mentally send that to somebody else. So they're the sender, they're sending the information. So they would see something on their computer, and then the receiver, who in this case would be the speller, the non-speaking autistic individual, their computer would basically be blank, and they would be asked to enter whatever information they were getting into the computer. I did have some telepathy data from those experiments, and just to speak to that first, it was pretty impressive, and most of that data came from one particular individual. His name's Houston, and he's featured quite a bit in the Telepathy Tapes. And one of the reasons that he's featured so much is because he's kind of the perfect participant for these things, because he actually does have pretty good motor control, and he can sit pretty still. He's very accurate, and he can just do this all day long. So what we did was a member of the research team held his spelling board for him, and this member of the team didn't know what any of the words or numbers were either. So they were blind to whatever the target was for the telepathy experiment. And then Houston would spell. He uses a pencil and he pokes it through kind of a stencil. So that way you know exactly what letter or number he's trying to convey. And Houston basically didn't miss anything. So we could give him a 4-digit number, a random 4-digit number, right? So whatever, 8749, 8749. He'd get it every single time. We had the computer set up where we could say, well, let's do 1-syllable words or 2-syllable words or 3-syllable words. And because we'd already seen what he was capable of, we just went straight to 3-syllable words. And again, didn't miss any of them. He would respond immediately. So there wasn't a delay. It wasn't like he had to work for it. As far as I could tell, there was no way he could get any cues from somebody. I don't know what kind of cues his mother could have sent him across the table where he could have spelled manager, for example. What's the likelihood that somebody's going to guess the correct 3-syllable word, right? So even if they do it once, it's kind of astronomical. So the telepathy tests themselves were pretty impressive, and they were impressive both because of the accuracy, the speed at which he responded. Again, once his mother would see a target word, he would start responding immediately. So that was incredibly impressive. And especially when you think about previous research with telepathy, up until this type of research, telepathy research historically, because people have been studying telepathy for a long time, but it would be with just sort of people, university students or, people that they recruited out in the community. They would set up these tests, and they would be what's called a forced choice test. So, for example, they would use things like a deck of cards with different symbols, like 5 different symbols. So there's 5 different cards. It's like a plus, a square, a circle, things like that. So the sender would see a card, and then the receiver would have to guess between 5 options. Was it a circle? Was it a square? Was it whatever? So that was the kind of testing that was done historically. It's called forced choice because it's one of the 5 choices. And so you've got a 20% chance of getting it right just by guessing. So in order for it to be significant, you would have to score significantly higher than 20% for it to be meaningful at all. And after decades of this kind of research, the results were significant, meaning that it looked like something interesting was happening, but it was like 30% or 35% or something like that. And this is with forced choice. And so what we're seeing with these individuals, this is an open-ended response. All they know is it's a 3-syllable word. That's a whole lot different than it's one of these 5 images. Pick one. And so that's the other part that's just remarkable, right? Is that they don't miss, even when it's this open-ended kind of testing scenario, which is way more difficult than any of the previous type of tests. When we talk about telepathy, really what we're talking about is the ability to gain information that is in somebody else's mind. And sometimes telepathy can be two-way, like people can communicate, at least in theory, without any words or without anything else. But in these instances, it's usually one way. The speller is picking up information. It's usually from their primary caregiver, where they seem to have the strongest connection to sort of help them stay connected to their bodies so that they can actually engage in the motor skills necessary. Like in some instances when we were doing this, somebody from the team, from the Telepathy Tapes team, would just grab a random book off of a bookshelf and flip it to a random page and pick a spot and then show that to the mom and say, okay. And they would spell the whole sentence. They knew it was words, right? They knew it was words. They knew it was out of a book. But again, being able to spell an entire sentence, that's crazy, right? What's the likelihood of that? It's impossible. It's impossible, statistically. Or another example, this was actually the first day of filming when we were looking at this. And the film crew was equally just blown away, right? By what because you can imagine they're sitting there filming this all day, but they don't really get to engage. They're just watching this. At the end of the day, one of the people on the film crew just took it upon himself to kind of approach, this was actually Houston again, and he had written a word on a piece of paper and was holding it to his chest and went up to Houston and said, hey, do you know what I've got written on this piece of paper? Houston just spelled it out, right? Friend was what he spelled out. And so this was somebody he'd never met. It could have been anything on that piece of paper. So I've seen enough things that I'm sure that they would do well. But again, the results would be even more impressive. Not even knowing if it's a word or a number or a symbol or something else. Neurodivergence is really sort of a umbrella term. Their neurological functioning is divergent. There's something different about the way that their nervous system operates compared to kind of what we expect, right? So this kind of narrow view of this is normal, right? And then if somebody's nervous system doesn't behave that way for whatever reason, then they would be neurodivergent. And so, different people use that term in different ways. There's some people that say, well, like ADHD is neurodivergent. So that's a much broader kind of way of thinking about that definition. It's usually used in reference to folks who have a diagnosis of autism or something related. And it may not even necessarily be that they can't communicate verbally at all, but there may be limited verbal communication or things of that nature. There's usually some sort of difficulty managing your body in different ways, so motor planning or things like that. You'll often see atypical behaviors. They call them stereotypical behaviors is what they call them. But so things like hand flapping or turning in circles or things like that. There's often some concerns with social interaction and things of that nature. So, the autism spectrum, there's a lot of different things that could be involved, and not everybody has all of them, and they have them to varying degrees. But this process has actually taught me a lot because, what I've learned is that many of these individuals, they're actually extremely bright. They're very aware of what's happening in the environment, even though we thought they weren't. They're actually very emotionally involved and connected. They talk about love and they talk about connection with other people, that this is really important to them. That goes against what we've kind of traditionally thought about some of these individuals. I think maybe we need to revisit, what we think we know about autism, because I've historically greatly underestimated these individuals. And so that's been humbling and actually kind of embarrassing. It's actually part of the challenge for many of them is that they're so emotionally connected that they're very affected by things that happen around them because they're so sensitive to it. So it's the exact opposite of what we thought. It's like they're not paying attention at all. They don't have this sort of emotional capacity. And it's like, no, it's the exact opposite. When we're talking about savant abilities, really what we're talking about is people that demonstrate a really advanced skill of some kind or ability of some kind that didn't come from traditional learning. The examples that we see or we think about sometimes are advanced musical abilities or mathematics or languages, things like this. These savant abilities typically show up in people who have a diagnosis of autism. That's the most common population that demonstrates these. It's still semi-rare, even in that population. But, there's just some incredible things, where people can play a symphony and they've never really had any formal piano instruction, or being able to see the world in sort of mathematical, geometric visualizations. And this is something that, Dr. Powell talks about. Perhaps telepathy should be considered a savant ability. It's kind of the same thing. Like they've got the same population has this ability to do something that most people don't have, and they have it at a very high level, and they didn't have to learn how to do it. They just have it. And I think one of the interesting discussions around this is the fact that we accept savant ability. Nobody argues about that. It's like, are there savants? Yes. Nobody's going to argue that there aren't savants. We don't understand how it works. It doesn't make any logical sense based on how we understand the brain, how we understand consciousness, physics. None of it makes any sense. But we accept that it's real. But then yet when we see something like telepathy, it's like, no, that can't be real. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Why, right? Like we accept this other thing that doesn't make any sense and we don't understand. So I think it's actually a really good argument for why we should be considering, telepathy, that it's real, it's happening. And then secondarily, like maybe it is a savant ability. Like most of the research to this point has been case studies, which is great, but it's hard to do a full-blown study, especially if you're not affiliated with the university and there's no funding. But how do you get enough attention or funding or resources to actually do a full-blown study? Again, going back to the very first time that I was witness to this, the production team had rented a Airbnb in Burbank, and the person that we were working with her name's Mia, and her family is from Mexico. And so they're all Spanish speaking, except for one of the cousins who speaks English. And so she came along to help translate. So the whole family comes up from Mexico. We're in Burbank. We've got this house full of people and cameras and audio and all kinds of things going on. This was my first exposure. And they said, well, let's just do some simple tests first before we start getting the brain mapping involved. Because that's a whole thing, putting on an EEG cap and all of that. And so we didn't want to just start by sticking things on people's heads and making things more complicated. And so they were also trying to kind of keep as many of us that weren't directly involved out of the way. So I was sitting outside watching on a monitor what was happening. They started with I think it was like a 3-digit number maybe. And, just watching just the effortlessness and just bang, 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 one after another. I mean, honestly, that was the first time, literally my jaw hit the floor. I was kind of it's one thing to read about it and to talk about it. But then when you see it, with your own eyes, it's kind of wait a minute, what? You got to do a double take, right? Because it kind of shakes your whole reality. By the time we started doing the second and third rounds of tests with people, and even with Mia later in the day, it's you just get so used to it. You get used to it so quickly that it's kind of okay, all right, yeah, she got another, thing, right? Okay. It's weird how quickly you adapt. And it's just yeah, this is normal. It's no big deal, right? And it's kind of okay. Mia's energy was just great. I mean, I think she had a smile on her face the whole time. The whole time. Just this big, giant smile, right? There was a lot of downtime because cameras are being readjusted. Okay, what's the next test? Okay, where do we need the cameras? Okay, what? All this stuff's going on. So, Mia and her mom have to just kind of sit there and hang out, waste time, waiting for the next shot. And so they would play these little games. I was kind of watching them. All this other stuff's going on. And I was kind of watching them. And they were sitting at a table. This was a game they would play at home. Her mom had a bag full of colored popsicle sticks. I think there were 6 colors. Green, red, yellow, blue, etc. She would, either have Mia close her eyes, or we even did it later where we blindfolded her. We put a blindfold on her. And so they'd reach in the bag, mix them up, pull out a random popsicle stick, hand it to Mia, and then she would lay it on the table in the correct pile, right? There was piles for blue, red, yellow, green, whatever. So she was just doing one after another, hand her another one, boop, stick it right in the right pile. And it was okay, wait a minute, because that's not even telepathy, right? What is that, right? She's not reading somebody's mind, or maybe she was, I don't know. But it's was she seeing through her mom's eyes? Was she somehow able to see without using her physical eyes? I don't know. But, it's a whole different thing. And they were just playing it casually, right? It was a way to kill time in between recordings. This is a challenging population to do research with for lots of reasons. Not the least of which is that, we really need to be respectful of their needs and their wants and needs and goals. And we certainly don't want to end up treating them like guinea pigs. Many of them can get overstimulated very easily. If they're in a new environment, that can be really challenging. At least the way some of them describe things, they're very sensitive to the energy around them. So if there's a lot of people, or people are in a bad mood, or people are being negative, that's going to influence them. So they can get dysregulated, relatively easily. And, they don't have great motor control a lot of times. They have sensitivity to sensory information. So, when I was trying to do the EEG data, and it's still an ongoing issue, right? Because you have to put a tight-fitting cap on their head, ear clips, you have to squirt gel into each one of these electrodes and then scratch it on their scalp. It's not comfortable if you're not sensitive. But then if you've got some sensitivities, you can imagine that's not going to be very much fun. So we have a lot of challenges, to really get good data. And then think how much work it takes to communicate. So they have to spell one letter at a time. And it takes a lot of work, in some cases, that motor planning to be able to point to the right letter. That's a lot of work. The previous research that I've done has mostly been looking at the brains of mediums and psychics and some energy healers as well. My goal was and still is, can I get enough of this case study data so that you can start to see patterns in what's going on in the brains of folks when they're engaged in these activities. And even though I've only got data on 3 of these, non-speaking autistic individuals while they're doing telepathy, I've got something. And it's great that I've got this other data because I can start to compare and go like, is there anything similar or different about what we're seeing? And it's a little bit of both. We did start to see some patterns in the brain. And really what we see is that there are certain brain regions that are frequently involved with psychic mediumship readings. So for example, the occipital lobe, the very back of the brain, which is visual processing, or that's a big part of what it does. That shows up over and over again as being involved in psychic readings. They might be seeing certain kinds of information, but they're seeing it in their mind, but it's showing up in the occipital lobe, just like if you were looking at something out here. There's a lot of right hemisphere stuff that shows up with psychics and mediums. It seems to be a very right hemisphere oriented process. So there's a spot in the back right quadrant that shows up a lot. It's sometimes called the God spot. So it has to do with boundaries between self and others. And so a lot of times when mediums in particular are doing their work, that part of the brain will kind of go offline. It's like it kind of shuts down. At least the theory is that that's how they're getting out of the way, that they're getting their small self, their ego self out of the way so that they can expand out to something else. So there's things like that we see over and over again. And then when you look at least the data that I've got so far with the telepathy data, I have seen, at least with 2 of the individuals, that God spot act up or, kind of shut down. It's really more of a shutting down because it has to stop doing its normal function, because its normal function is to create boundaries. We have to get it to stop doing that so that you can expand beyond your boundaries. You also see a lot of right hemisphere shift. So this was really evident with Houston. There was a big shift in activity in the right and left hemispheres, both of them. It was like you could draw a line right down the middle of the head. And it was like the hemispheres were acting totally differently. And so the other thing that shows up a lot is the frontal lobe. And this showed up with everybody. And I think it has partly to do with 2 things. One, with inhibiting information. So a lot of what the brain does when it's normally working is tries to inhibit information. It tries to keep things narrow, right? So that we're only paying attention to what is relevant right now in this exact moment. In many cases, that frontal lobe will become sort of disinhibited. So more information is able to come through. Then there's also stuff in the right frontal lobe, which has to do more with attention. So how you're paying attention. I think with all of them, we saw changes in the frontal lobes. But it varies. And this is the thing that's interesting. So even with the non-speakers, they didn't all do the exact same thing. Their brains did slightly different things to get them there. But there was some significant overlap with what I've seen with other psychics and mediums. So it tends to make me think that, again, that there's something to this, right? That there's a pattern. We see enough consistency. I think we're starting to zero in on at least which brain regions are probably the most important. But it's interesting because with this population, some of them talk about that they didn't even realize they had a body initially. That's part of the problem with the motor planning. They need help grounding and getting into their body. So that raises interesting questions, because if they're not connected to their body, well, then what are they doing? Where are they at? And some of them talk about these experiences of going on the hill, which is this apparent astral plane chat room kind of a thing where a lot of these non-speakers go to hang out. They go and hang out and talk to each other and have conversations and teach each other stuff. And it's all telepathic. Well, are they leaving their bodies and going there? Or is it telepathic communication? Like, what exactly is happening when they're doing this? And again, we don't really know. We don't have any answers to any of this because it's all just kind of it's like a can of worms, right? One of the families that I'm just starting to work with right now, his name's Trevor and the mom's name is Laura. They both love music. I don't know if they're musicians exactly, but they love music. And this is another one of those instances where Laura just figured out pretty recently that Trevor was telepathic. So one of the games they play is that Laura will hum a song in her head, or she'll sing the lyrics of a song in her head. And, she won't say it out loud. The music won't be on in the room. She'll just pick a random song and then ask him, what song am I singing in my head? He'll get the song right. And then she'll ask him, what band is it? He'll get the band right. Who's the lead singer, right? Gets the lead singer right. And it's interesting too, because it's not just one genre of music. There's some like alternative stuff. There's some 80s stuff. She'll use songs from when he was a little kid that he really liked, like little kid songs. And so it doesn't really matter what the song is. He gets it right. It raises interesting questions because, does Trevor, did he memorize, the album and the lead singer, or is he getting that out of Laura's head too? Right? Because she obviously knows the answer to those things. It makes me think he's getting it from her, that he's just kind of tapping into her and going like, okay, yeah. Because, some of my other areas of interest involve looking at other technologies and how they can influence nervous system functioning. And of course, I use a lot of technology, but I also use more ancient technologies. So sound and vibration, we can influence the nervous system in lots of different ways. And so it wouldn't be surprising to me at all if there were specific types of music or specific frequencies that would be useful, either for some of these non-speakers to help them regulate their nervous system or whatever. In fact, I was just talking with a mom recently about using a vibroacoustic technology with their son just to help him be more connected to his body. So you're getting a vibration in your body so you can feel your body and help regulate a little bit more, right? Like stay kind of more grounded. But we also know, one of the areas I've been exploring is, can we use some of these technologies to nudge the brain toward a state that is more psi receptive? We know that inhibiting the frontal lobe seems to be important. Well, we can use technology to do that. We can put a little thing on your frontal lobe and send in a frequency that quiets down your frontal lobe. Starting to kind of work with technologies and figuring out like, okay, how can we use this to almost reverse engineer what we're learning, right? So for, those of us that aren't just naturally telepathic, right? Okay, is there something that I can do to help facilitate that ability in myself, right? To connect to others, to connect to the spirit world, whatever that is, to connect to psychic information. And, so far, even though it's sort of preliminary data, it seems like we've got some pretty solid evidence that we can do this. The fact that all of these individuals that we're talking about in the telepathy tapes are not reliably able to use verbal language. And so, that's one of the questions, right? Is like, is that a significant aspect of this? Why is it that they have such a strong ability? And it may be that the fact that they're not able to use verbal language, that may actually help them with these telepathic abilities, right? So, kind of phrased another way, us using language, all of us that do use verbal language, it may actually inhibit our ability to hear the more subtle information. We're kind of drowning it out with, our words. It's interesting too, because language for most people is a primarily left hemisphere function. The brain is funny because there's a lot of redundancy. A lot of times the right and left hemispheres are doing similar things, but language for the vast majority of people is extremely left hemisphere. Whereas the right hemisphere is much more present moment awareness. It's experiencing what's happening in the moment as opposed to thinking about it or talking about it. And one of the things that always strikes me is that as soon as you put words on something, you've actually changed its nature. When you put a label on something, all of a sudden you've changed it. You've put it in a category. You've said this is what it is. And so you've limited it. So words actually limit things, right? Which is a useful function when we're trying to communicate with each other, but it also takes us out of the true experience of what something is. I use this example a lot when I'm talking about this, that, most of the major world religions, they will say that you can't really talk about God, because as soon as you talk about God, you've kind of screwed it up, right? Because God is everything. As soon as you start trying to describe God, you've limited God. Is there something to this, right? That it's like, if you're not constantly labeling and categorizing and analyzing your experience, maybe then you just have the experience. And maybe that's more of a true way of communicating and understanding things, which I think is also why most of the psychic mediums, what you see is a shift into their right hemisphere. They're getting out of that sort of interpretive, language-based mode in order to dial in, with just more of a pure information.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider supporting the channel by checking out the link in the description. See you in the next one.